Welcome back to the Expat Files. Tay Nix here. I have just a wonderful guest today, a gentleman that I met through a worldwide network, the Mavericks Project, which you can read about. There's a link below this video. We have a live event coming up in Dallas. And my guest today is Logan Craft. Logan might be the most interesting man in the world.
Huh.
And I think you will agree. We all joke on our private chat channel. Every time Logan checks in, he not only is full of pithy wisdom, but a wealth of experience, as you're about to discover, in so many different and valuable pursuits in life that I just had to get him on the podcast. So, Logan, welcome. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. Appreciate you spending the time with us here. Where to begin? In our brief chat before I hit the record button, you were already spilling some tremendous stuff. You have a really unique story to tell about where you are today or how you got to where you are today. And by that, I don't mean geographically, but the kind of experiences that you've had in business and with some pretty heavy hitters in our political institutions as well. And so,
Mhm.
why don't you start with at least some portion of your upbringing so people know where you came up from and some of the people that you grew up with or near to, and your
Sure.
father's business and some of the things that you saw in your formative years before you had sort of big realizations, maybe an epiphany or two in there, and some of the things that you've gone on to do in the intervening years as well. Start wherever you like, my friend.
Well, thank you, Tane. I appreciate you inviting me to come and talk with you on your podcast. And I appreciate all the accolades there. There are plenty of people that are way more interesting than me out there in the wider world. And I don't have anything notable about myself to report, no extraordinary achievements, and nothing that is could be classified as in any way famous or notable, apart from one unusual characteristic that I have, along with many other people in the world, and that is I've had an amazingly eclectic life and career. So that is the main sort of uniqueness about the experiences that I've been able to have through my journey here. And the journey begins in Texas. So I was born in Dallas, Texas, not long before the assassination attempt on President Kennedy. So I was alive during that time. So a little older than maybe than I might look. But I grew up in Texas, and I was a third generation Texas. My father and my grandfather and uh, my family on my other side of my family, my mother, were all businessmen. And I had a grandfather who was the president of a railroad in Texas. So a pretty well-known railroad that ran from New Orleans all the way into New Mexico through El Paso and along the Mexican border and then branched off into other places. So at one time, that railroad, when he was involved with it, was the largest employer in Texas and was the largest landowner of Texas, along with the mineral rights in Texas that come with land ownership. So it was a very wealthy enterprise. It also had a steamship line that operated out of New Orleans and Galveston and other ports. And during the time that he was involved as an executive, um, World War II was going on. So he was running a railroad and a steamship line and a port that was of major importance in the Gulf of Mexico, New Orleans, and the port of Houston, which was as or even more important. Um, and so that was my family's background, along with his wife, who had been involved with the United States State Department when she was younger. They met in Europe during World War One, and my grandmother was also involved in an early women's espionage group that was formed in Washington, D.C., where she was living if, and she was going to finishing school. So she was a young woman in Washington, D.C. She was the daughter of a judge and who was a lawyer. He was kind of interesting guy. He owned a showboat too on the Ohio River out of Louisville. and he had quite a colorful family background, almost scandalous. But his youngest daughter was my grandmother, and he sent her to Washington to be educated, and there she got approached by an early form of the Women's Intelligence Services, long before even the OSS existed, well before the CIA. This is in the 19 teens. This is my grandmother,
Good
who was
heavens.
born in 1893, is when she was born. So she was like 20 years old, and she got picked up by them. She worked for the ambassadors.
Mavericks Project is a private community focused on powerful connections, trusted information, and time-tested solutions to create and preserve wealth during our epoch of extreme change. The Mavericks Project was born out of the social, economic, and geopolitical schism that kicked off in 2020. A small band of contrarian misfits spent the lockdown years observing problems, analyzing the implications, and plotting solutions. Now, several times a year, we Mavericks get together in fun and fascinating locations to talk about solutions to the social dangers to your family's safety and how to avoid them, the increasing state surveillance and how to negate it, the rapidly declining U.S. empire and how we want to position for what's coming next, the risks to your family's generational wealth and how to protect it. If you think you have what it takes to be a Maverick, this is your chance to come make new and better friends with some of the most accomplished people you will ever meet. Join us from November 4th to 7th in Dallas, Texas for 3 unforgettable days of action, discussion, and answers. The link for the event, along with all the details, is below this video.
So she was on the staff of the ambassadors, which women were then starting to do. It was sort of part of the whole suffragette movement. Women were doing a lot more in the workplace. She was part of that. And then the war started during that time, and she was sent to London to work for the ambassador to the United Kingdom at the court of St. James. And then, yep, she worked there during the war. And then she was transferred over to what was neutral territory in Holland. And she was posted at The Hague, which is where they were trying to work out the war. They were sort of like having the armistice treaty meetings partly at The Hague, because it was an international court and Holland was not a belligerent country. So anyway, she met my grandfather, who was a officer in the American Expeditionary Force. And he was stationed different places, but he was in Rotterdam for a while. So they met. They had the distinction of both, by that time, speaking some Dutch, and she spoke French already. And they fell in love and they got married. And he ended up coming back and returning to pursuing a career in the railroads. And then he ended up becoming a railroad executive and ultimately, like I said, the president, during a time when the railroad was super important. My father then kind of followed in his footsteps. He was his only son. And my father ended up going not into the railroad business, but into the steel business, steel manufacturing, big steel mills. And so he got involved in that. And over time, he became an industrialist, and he built factories and started making oil tools and other things like that. And that's what I was raised around. So I was raised around the steel business and the oil business. We were living in Houston, Texas at most of my life, as well as a ranch in Blanco County. And everybody was in the oil business. You didn't find people that weren't related to the oil business in one way or another. And then that was also the beginning, when I was a young person, in the oil boom, which occurred after the oil embargo by the Arab OPEC nations in 1973, which coincided also uniquely, ironically, if you think about it, with taking the United States dollar off the gold standard and pegging it to the petrodollar. So conveniently, petroleum went way up in value. And since the dollar was pegged to petroleum now, under an arrangement that Henry Kissinger made, oil went from around, $5 a barrel to like 40. So that's like an
Boom
eight.
times. Yeah.
That's it. Good times in Texas and Oklahoma and Louisiana and other oil states. So it was crazy times growing up. And that was my background. So I was groomed by my father to become an industrialist like him. And I was sent around different places to work and get experience. He sent me to England, We traveled to different places in the world and met with um, all kind of manufacturers. He was heavily involved also in the armaments manufacturing business,
Yes.
big time, which is a big business in Texas. And he did a ton of business with Mexico, as my grandfather had done with the railroad. And I got acquainted with that. And then after university, um, I went to work for a Belgian oil company first, based out of Brussels. So I went to work for Petrofina SA, which has been absorbed, I think, since then by Elf, the French oil company. But I went to work for them. And then I went and got a graduate degree. And then I joined my father's company and carried on business out of Los Angeles, out of Dallas, and in Mexico, and in Europe, and all over the United States. And I did that for a decade. And during that time, I was also heavily involved with some charities that I was involved with as a board member and board president of a orphanage, and also a charity that helped homeless people, which was a big charity that my family was involved with, trying to help homeless poor. So my father, because he was a native Houstonian, he knew everybody. And because his father was a big civic leader and a big corporate executive, so my father knew everybody. And Houston had grown from a city of around 200, maybe 50,000 when he was a boy to 2 or 3 million people. It became a big city. And some of the people that were there during that period of time when he was hitting his stride as a businessman were politicians, including George Bush Sr., and his son also lived there, George Bush Jr. You know, they were in our sort of social network because they went to the same church. They were members of the same clubs, and they socialized with my father, who was then giving a lot of political contributions and his company to politicians in Washington, D.C., and George Bush Sr. included, and Ronald Reagan prior to that. My father had a close connection with um, Ronald Reagan's unofficial cabinet because he had worked with them in the steel business. They were out of California, where I lived too and worked in Los Angeles. And so that's sort of the family background there of work. And then I left the family business um, and sold my stock back to the company. And I started a career then as a Episcopal priest in Canada. I moved to Vancouver, Canada with my new wife, Barbara, and I got another degree at University of British Columbia. I had been educated originally at UT in Austin. I had a business degree from UT Austin. And we moved to Canada. We had a wonderful experience living there. We lived on an island in the greater Vancouver area and
Lovely.
spent our time cruising around the Georgia Strait and going to Whistler to ski. So it was a great time. I made a lot of good friends who ended up being business partners of mine later. But I was committed to becoming an Episcopal or Anglican priest at that time. And I decided I would just get out of business entirely. And just, you know, I had some investments, but I was not going to pursue business activity. It's just going to do, you know, Anglican priest things.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I ended up moving from Vancouver to join a church that was in a very interesting city, historic city in New Mexico, the state capital, Santa Fe. And I joined a historic Anglican or Episcopal church there. And that church was going through a big growth period. I seemed to be pretty lucky or adept at raising funds for nonprofits, which I'd been doing by that time for almost a decade and a half or 2 decades almost, different kinds of nonprofits that I was involved with. And so that church, we raised a lot of money for it. We did a big addition. The congregation grew. It was huge. And during that time, I was asked to join a venture capital board that was based out of Santa Fe. Because the guy that was the principal of it, he found out about my business background. I wasn't only a priest, I had business experience. So he asked me to join that. It had originally been formed in Silicon Valley, but he moved it to Santa Fe because that's where he wanted to live. So then I got a bunch of exposure to venture capital and private equity, being involved with them. And then he asked me to do some other things that were enumerated, and I joined those companies as well, the portfolio companies. And during that time, I also started a talk show. Um, so I was a really busy guy at that time. I was a priest. I had a talk show that it was, came on every Sunday evening on cable television, and I was a very active venture capitalist, board of director, and portfolio consultant. And and I was also really involved with Ducks Unlimited, which tries to save the duck population. It's a group in the U.S. called Ducks Unlimited, which plants duck habitat, and it's also a hunting group, but mainly it's about preserving and expanding wild waterfowl wildlife. I was involved with that, and I was also involved with some other groups that were into wildlife management in that vein. And what ended up oddly happening was the the venture capital company ended up buying a roll up in the outdoor space, and they bought a bunch of outdoor manufacturers who made outdoor equipment and camping gear and also hunting gear. And then they ended up buying a very high-end specialty gun company that was sort of high-end, collector item guns and shotguns for the the discreet hunter that was hunting wherever in the world. And because they knew about my hunting background, I'd been raised on this ranch in Texas too my whole life, so I'd hunted since I was little. They asked me to join the company as a contractor to appear as the presenter on their hunting shows. So by this time, I was a Presbyterian minister. I started a new Presbyterian church after we'd finished with the Anglican. And I had this Presbyterian church that I was developing with a colleague. And I was on the venture board. And then they asked me, and I had my talk show. And then they asked me to do these hunting shows that were going to appear on ESPN Outdoors and the Outdoor Channel and one other channel, one other third channel. And so the way it was, the company would team up with a a show, and then we would be the sponsor of that show. And they would send me around, and I had a lot of flexibility in my time. I had 6 weeks off every year, and I had time off. So they'd send me around, and I would showcase their firearms, and then I would do a program all over the world. They would send me to places in North America and Africa. By that time, I'd hunted in Europe. And I did this for 3 years while I was building the church. And that became my new sort of media show as presenter. I was the presenter before on the talk show. And then I was approached by some Canadian friends of mine from Vancouver about producing a film, a feature film. So I was, so I at first I just wanted to help them out, and I just introduced them to some of the people in our congregation who were very wealthy people, and who I thought would have an interest in their topic, and they did. So they can, they were willing to invest in their film. And then these two Canadians came back and said, "Look, would you consider joining us with an equity position, and as a director and as the chairman of the holding company and a producer? You've got all this television experience, and
Right.
you're familiar with the controversial topic that we want to cover, because I covered it on my talk show." And I thought about it, and I prayed about it, and I, talked to my wife. And by that time, we had two young daughters who were born. So I was raising very young daughters. And I had this church growing, and we had bought a building, and we were renovating the building. It was like a huge building. And so I decided I should do this, and I rolled off the all of the outdoor programming stuff, and I rolled into the feature film. And for 3 years, I developed that film. It was a big film in the sense that it was a documentary, and we filmed it all over the world. And I got a special arrangement with my church. Unfortunately, I had a full-time colleague, and so I made an arrangement. I actually tendered my resignation, but they didn't want me to leave. So they wanted me to stay on staff. So I stayed on staff very much and continued the stuff a Presbyterian minister does. And I was making this feature film that was starring Ben Stein, who's kind of a pundit, who was in Bueller's, you know, Day Off, and he's the guy that says
Yes.
Bueller Bueller. That's Ben Stein, who'd been a speechwriter for, you know, one of the presidents, and whose father had been an economist at the White House with Nixon. He had a Yale law degree, Ben did, and he was living in Beverly Hills. So we signed Ben to our movie. I actually signed him in a barbecue joint, like in Central California on a road trip. And we signed Ben. He became our star of the film, this sort of documentary, docudrama. And we filmed that, and then when we released it, it was the number one documentary in the United States in the year that it came out.
And what year is this?
It's 2008.
Okay.
So it was number one. And what was really interesting about that, Tane, was um, the day that it was released, or the weekend that it was released, which was in April, I believe, of '08. So this is before the financial crash of '08, '09, is April of '08. And the day it came out, the weekend, it was a weekend, we were sued. The film was sued, and I was sued personally because I was an officer on all of the companies. Uh, we were sued by Harvard University. We were sued by EMI Records, and we were sued by Yoko Ono Lennon and John Lennon's two sons, also. And we were sued over two types of copyright infringement, because copyright and copyright infringement is federal law in the United States. So it's a federal case. These were not criminal cases. Of course, these were civil. So there were plaintiffs who came and said they violated copyright law in their film, even though we had gone through the most extreme gauntlet of fair use, and copyright lawyers out of Los Angeles and Hollywood, the cream of the crop. We'd spent $250,000 on copyright lawyers alone. They still sued us, and they sued us out of the Second District Federal Court in Manhattan, which we're all familiar with because that's where Epstein was. That's where Trump was tried. That's where all the shenanigans and the misdoings and the misdeeds.
Shenanigans. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
Shenanigans Central. Yeah.
that's Shenanigans Central. Yeah. So
Yeah.
they sued us in Southern District Court of Manhattan. And because they didn't like our film. And so they said we committed copyright fraud. Well, ends up we got a phone call. I'm sitting there in my office in downtown Dallas in the Chase building. I had an office in Dallas and had an office in Santa Fe at the time, and I had my church there. And it was a phone call from a lawyer who is a professor at Stanford University, literally. And he calls me up and he said, "I've seen the filing on this copyright infringement, and I'd like to talk to you about it. I'm so and so with Stanford Law School, preeminent law school, you know, one of the top 5 in the States, and maybe the best." And so I said, "Sure. What do you want to discuss?" And he said, "Well, I think that this is an egregious lawsuit, and I'd like you to consider whether you would allow us to represent you in part pro bono, because we have a vested interest in protecting digital freedom of speech rights, and we think that this is a infringement on your freedom of speech, the First Amendment." So I said, "Sure, let's talk," because our legal bills, I could see they were mounting, like, you know, into the millions of
I can
dollars
imagine.
to
Yeah.
defend ourselves from Harvard, Yoko Ono, and EMI Records, which was the largest record company of the world at that time. Like between these three, unlimited financial resources, and we were a
Right.
little fledgling documentary film company. Now, we had raised millions of dollars for our film and distributed it, and it was one of the largest distributions to date for a documentary. It's on 1,000 screens. That's a lot of screens. At that time, there were only 37,000 screens in the United States. So it's a big film. And here's the real catch, Tane, which shouldn't be lost on anybody. Because of we were served 2 or 3 days after it was released, our lawyers demanded, and the court agitated, that we needed to stop all advertising for our film. We didn't have to remove it from the screens, but we had to stop advertising. All right? No advertising. like none. And the film still remained as the #1 documentary uh, for the rest of the year until November, when it was eclipsed finally by Bill Meyer of the Politically Incorrect's documentary called Religulous. So we were the #2 documentary with no advertising. And we were in the top 10 of documentaries for years and years.
Aside from the lawsuit, what made the film controversial? What was...
So the interesting thing about the film was my Canadian partners came and approached me. It was not my idea originally, it was theirs. But I agreed with them that it was a relevant issue. And so the issue was this. The issue was the fact that they believed that neo-Darwinism had some real weaknesses in trying to explain development of life forms on the basis of random mutation alone. So a lot of the new nanoscience was coming out with a lot of evidence that, it wasn't debunking macroevolution. It wasn't even debunking microevolution necessarily. But what it was really challenging was Darwin's theory that that small incremental changes over time were occurring entirely on the basis of random mutation. Now, the reason why this was an existential issue was, of course, that is an underpinning for a view of reality and the universe which can, negate the existence of a designer, can negate the existence of a God, can negate the existence of design, that everything is by chance. Well, Darwinism was on fragile grounds, neo-Darwinism championed by Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, the New Atheists, and others. So our film was a direct challenge to the New Atheists. I mean, I was an Anglican Presbyterian minister, so I was obviously a theist.
Right.
I believed in God. That would be go without saying. But I was not a creationist in the sense that I didn't believe in evolution. I came to the conclusion through research and study that the explanations for evolution, as they were popularly held and even popularly taught, were deficient. The explanations had some real gaps that needed some explaining that was not being explained adequately by Darwin or his immediate progenitors. And the theory was being held onto, random mutation particularly, was being held onto because it was sort of a secular creation narrative that was being propped up. And if random mutation wasn't the locomotive or the mechanism pulling life forms through an evolutionary process, well, what was?
Mm-hmm.
And the what was in our film that was explored was that the design within the human cell, which Darwin knew nothing of, they had very, very rudimentary understandings of what was in the cell. Well, now we know. As one scientist has aptly said, if Darwin thought that the cell was protoplasm, a kind of a gel of building blocks, what we know now about it is that it's an entire universe.
Yeah.
And so this was a real problem that establishment science was having to change their narrative. And unfortunately, because of the vested interests within the scientific community, and where have we seen recently some vested interest within the scientific community
I
who
can't
says,
remember. I'm trying to put my finger on it.
who says that this is the consensus and there's no alteration from it. There's no other, for instance, there's no other drugs that can, other than the one we're proffering to you, that can actually remedying the problem. Well, these scientists in evolutionary biology, which is the one field, notably, that cannot prove its major theorems by repeatable studies easily. So some of their most important foundations, they cannot actually create repeated studies. And by the way, one thing that some people don't realize, but is offered freely and was offered by Richard Dawkins, who we interviewed twice for our film. He appeared on our film, along with others, Daniel Dennett, who wrote notable books as one of the new. I interviewed Daniel myself in Venice, Italy, as the producer. So we know this space. I spent 3 years on it and spent millions of dollars researching it. I know what the fallacies are in the quote consensus science around random mutation and orthodox Darwinism. And I can tell you that orthodox Darwinism needs a revision, something akin how the new physicists in the early 20th century with Einstein and others had to revise Newtonian physics. Newtonian physics was physics through the 19th century and into the early 20th, but it was revised something like 45%. Necessarily by the new information that had come out by further research and development. Well, it's one thing to change physics. It was another thing to change the secular creation story that's built around random mutation and a lot of resistance. Well, just to note, Yoko Ono Lennon, whatever her virtues may be, and good points, she was a outspoken atheist, and she hated the fact that we had used part of her husband's song, Imagine, in our film, which was not even making a case for what was the real answer for how life forms came into existence or how the evolutionary process worked. We were only pointing out in the film that orthodox Darwinism has some real problems that need to be revised. And we were pointing out scientists that stand up and say this get persecuted. They got persecuted.
You kick the hornet's nest there. Yeah, I mean, you touch on a number of different things, and you touch on something that also affected my life and that I ran into. I quixotically tilted at the windmill of aiding a not a revision of the existing medical practice and system, but I tried to introduce self-healing kind of therapy, acupuncture in this case, but it was deeper than that, my training of doctors. And so I know the kind of resistance that you're referring to. I encountered it myself. Establishment, institutional thought that is fully vested and invested in a particular worldview, that is akin to, I mean, you essentially lived through the 20th century, 21st century equivalent of a witch trial, because you were calling into question something that was heretical, right? To bring up, and so
That's correct, Shane.
yeah,
and where that was the hallmark for me was, and I wasn't looking for trouble. That's not really my nature, but I don't run away from it either, usually. But the film was essentially about censorship. What the film was arguing is that, there ought not to be this rigid consensus on this issue, and authentic scientists should have an opportunity to explore what's the truth here. And at least in certain elements of the original Darwinian formula, it looked like that wasn't going to work anymore. And so what was? Well, how are you going to know unless you do research? And how do you know unless you're not going to get denied tenure and fired from your institution or university? That's what they were doing. So the film was about censorship. And then paradoxically or ironically,
they tried to censor you.
They tried to censor our film.
Yeah.
So this is a
case closed.
Case closed. And I had experienced censorship before, or pushback for freedom of speech in a very, very personal way. I won't go into that on the show. It's not that I would, but I don't want to take up all the time talking about it. But I had experienced another censorship. And I'd also seen how in the scientific community with my friend who was put in prison earlier, I discussed how institutions and individuals lie. And this is the real awakening that occurred for me over time, was that not only do notable individuals have pathological tendencies, but it was undeniable as I continued to mature as an adult that even in the most benign organizations like not-for-profits and churches, certainly in those too, but also in politics and in bureaucracies, agencies, and for-profit organizations, the institutional deception and wrongdoing is undeniable.
Is legion. Yeah.
I want to mention, though, that we won all our lawsuits against those three entities.
Bravo.
We won them, hands down. They ended up, after the first arguments of the case, And the first opining of the judges, there were two different judges, and in a state court in southern Manhattan and in the federal court in southern Manhattan. And both judges opined very strongly for us as defendants. And the plaintiffs all then at that point rolled up and went away.
Bravo. But you touch on two other things, if I can capture them here before they flee my mind. You are experiencing the shallows, and maybe it wasn't so shallow, of exactly what then became overt in the early 2020s. I mean, this tenet of institutions being invested in a particular point of view about the world, and the central principle of science, which again, right, sidestepping the whole censorship thing and the need to talk about things that are difficult and controversial and also not fully understood. The central principle of science is revision in light of new data.
That's right.
And to deny that turns it into, right, I mean, this is popularly referred to as scientism, where you sort of bring a bunch of pseudoscientific kind of thought or facts, quote unquote facts, and then you stand your entire institutional reputation on, no, we, right, like as we heard in recent memory, right? No, I am the science. We are the science. We know what's best. And this kind of expert problem that we've developed, where it's clear to any thinking individual, any person who's sane and of sound mind, right, that there are real problems in the institutions. And this was obviously brilliantly illustrated through the lockdown years. To what
COVID.
degree? Yeah, to what degree that was motivated by malevolence? Let's just play a mental exercise and assume that it was all genuine error. Okay, I know that's a big assumption.
It was
In
still
light,
error, though.
yeah. Sorry,
Even if none of it was malevolent, the capacity for human beings to make mistakes, we all know, is considerable.
is considerable, and the
Yes.
defense against that is free speech and the ability to go back and like, wait a second, what if we miss something in our axiomatic assumptions about reality, about evolution, about the way
Yes.
the race continues to evolve according to some principle that we don't fully understand yet, right? And
Well, yeah, that's
the
right.
people
That
who
we
are,
don't, and we may never fully understand.
and we may never fully understand, and nor should
Because
we. In some ways, though, and this gets into your, because I'm fascinated by your bent toward religion, but a genuine. You and I have talked privately, and that that it is evident. I think at least the guys like you and me, and maybe not to everybody, I don't know, but this dismissal of, right? I mean, atheists make me laugh. I mean, if they weren't taken so seriously, I think the whole thing would be really comical, because
yeah,
when you hear atheists argue, and when it's the argument against, it's like, well, what do you place the highest value on then? Because there's always a void of, and like I had this, it was an internal conversation about somebody that I know, that we both know, actually. I won't mention them here because I haven't fully formed my ideas, but this would be a debate to have over a good steak and a beer. Um, the rationalism. Rationalism, too, is a type of superstition, right? Like people who believe that everything on earth, and it's like either you haven't lived enough or you haven't had enough experience of life, but breaking down all of reality to like, oh, call off the search, we have the answer, right? There's
yes.
nothing else to see. Like we have it, right?
I think
I
you're dead right, Tane. And I think the thing to understand about rationalism and atheism and other isms that are similar is this, and I want to say this because I don't want to denigrate the term, but I want it to be clearly understood, which you will understand immediately. Rationalism and atheism are faith positions, but I'm not denigrating them because of that, because I actually believe strongly that there is a part, a very large part of some of the most important things that we can know as human beings, or that we grapple with, or that are mysteries that are important, that could not properly be understood except by a faith position. There is no way to know these things purely on the basis of a scientific methodology. That's my point. And I think where the flaw in rationalism and atheism, as it's popularly presented today is that they present themselves as positions that are somehow entirely based upon a scientific methodology, but that's impossible. That cannot be true.
Well,
It's
it breaks down.
demonstrably,
Yeah.
it is demonstrably untrue. And
Yeah.
therefore, what I criticize about atheism and rationalism is not the fact that I think that both are wrong or limited. Rationalism is limited, and atheism, I think, is wrong. But that's not the main problem that I see with them. It's that they're dishonest.
Exactly.
They need
The-
to admit, yes, that they also are, to their adherents. We also are a, if you will, faith position. We're not a religious faith position, but you can only believe some of our core tenets only on the basis of a lack of evidence that you must explain through some other means, other than there's no mathematical formula that will tell you atheism is true or that rationalism is the correct way to exist, right?
well,
So all we're
the,
saying is theists, if you want to say, I'm just a particular kind of theist. And what we're saying about the theory of evolution is, look, again, the producers of the film were not, we believed in evolution. But we all came to the conclusion that random mutation could not be accurate in explaining the story. And more to the point, that it was highly probable, based on the evidence we have now and the complexity of human and other forms of life, and the time frame we've had on the Earth to develop. Let's say it's 1.5 billion years out of an Earth that's 5 billion. You go for the regularly science approved version of the length of time. Even with that, you cannot get to us sitting here having this conversation. Not with
right.
1.5 billion. We'd need 20 billion years, Tane, to be sitting here talking based on random mutation. And it doesn't matter how much mutation you have. You could have 50 billion years, whatever. Some things are so interleaked in complexity that they just couldn't come about. So my problem is not that science is incomplete. It's that the scientific project presents answers that they cannot properly verify today.
But
They present their own versions of consensus, which are not faultless. They have mistakes in them. And there are other ways of healing other than what they present us, as you know, as an alternative practitioner.
that's right.
And so this is my problem with them, is that they are not, they're neither prudent nor humble in the pronouncements that they make. They should just stop and say, you know what? We don't know.
Yeah.
We're not sure. We don't have enough evidence, or like
And what's
we don't know what's driving this evolutionary process. Maybe it's a designer. It looks like a design, certainly, but it definitely isn't random.